paljon Frans ja kiitos kutsuksesta. On todella kiva olla täällä tänään ja kuten kuulutte, en puhu yhtä hyvin suomea kuin te, mutta toivottavasti voitte ymmärtää, jos puhun ja esitän englanniksi. Ja sanokaa vaan, jos jotain on epäselvä ja yritän sanoa sen selvemmin. Mutta joo, yritän jakaa mun PowerPointia nyt. Hetkinen. Ja toivottavasti näkyy nyt.
We can see your screen, but you should make the PowerPoint. Now we can see the PowerPoint.
Great, thank you. So yeah, me olen Sitran luontoa vahvistava kiertotaloustiimistä, and I'm here to talk about how circular economy, is it a tool for biodiversity loss or not? And hopefully you can hear me. I have a bit of a cold, but hopefully it should be fine so you can hear what I'm saying anyway. So I would just like to start and thank the previous speakers as well for interesting presentations. And I would like to start by saying a few words about Sitra, which may be familiar to some of you and some perhaps less so. So we've been around Sitra has been around for 55 years, and we are an independent future house and a think, do, connect tank. Maybe known a little bit more in the past as a financier of different projects, whereas now you could probably think of as more of a sort of societal change agent. And contrary to what many think, we're not a government agency, so we're not funded by tax money, but through the returns on endowment capital and capital investments. So we are there's no other Sitra in other countries, so it's kind of a unique setup, which at least I find quite interesting. And there are loads of different projects across a range of areas. So in lifelong learning, we look at how responsible ways of using data and democracy. So there are a bunch of different topics, and not least also finding solutions to the crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, as well as overconsumption of natural resources. So that's where you find me in that last area, and also you could say that's why I moved to Finland as well, because Finland has a pioneering role in the circular economy with the world's first national circular economy roadmap, as well as in education. You can see that even though Finland has quite a small population, you have the highest number of circular economy programs and courses in higher education in the world. So not just per capita, but you've gone all in to bring this to all levels of education. So I think that this was very inspiring, and why I became interested in Sitra's work to begin with, actually. And a lot has happened since. And I think I should mention also what the circular economy is, in essence. Is maybe more familiar to some of you and less so for others. So this is the butterfly diagram that has been developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which I used to work for before I came to Sitra. And essentially, it's a way of getting as much value from what we have as possible by dividing the economy into two parts, so biological as well as technical cycles. And we've heard about metals today as a steel. That would be the right part and the technical part. So we want to get as close to the center as possible, so to maintain as much value. We can recycle materials, but often value is lost if we recycle. So if we can keep things in use, that's of course better than recycling, for instance. And one way in which you can quantify this is so the Swedish Research Institute, Sweden, RISE, they have developed a way to divide this into 3 parameters, where you look at how long does something last, how much is it in use, and how much is it circulated. So 3 parameters that look at. So firstly, how long does it last? Secondly, what is the use rate? How efficiently is it actually used during that time? And thirdly, what is the rate of circulation? And I think that's all fine. But when you look at the left side and you include materials like food, you need a slightly different logic, because you can't keep food in use and use it as efficiently as possible. You have to consume it. So you need a slightly different logic for some materials. But the main logic is still that you well, you minimize waste and inputs into the process, for instance. So it's not too different. If I move on to the next slide, I think one thing that we have asked as well is that the circular economy it can be an end in itself. It's a more resilient economy. It's also a tool for reaching some of the most urgent crises that we're facing. And again, going back to steel and also other materials, we've shown in the past with material economics and other organizations as well that we can get about half of EU emissions can be tackled by a circular economy in heavy industry. So it can be a powerful force for climate mitigation. So recently, as we looked more at the in the last few years, I think you can say that the biodiversity has become more of an important topic, and it's gained more attention. So we were thinking, can we do something similar here? And see, for these materials, does the same hold true for biodiversity if we transition to a circular economy? And what we found is this by leading researchers from across the world in the seminal research piece called Bending the Curve, or the Integrated Action portfolio. You see this scenario that to bend the curve on biodiversity loss, we need conservation efforts. We need to conserve more land, to set aside more lands. That we know already. But what you also see on this slide is that we need to rethink consumption and production. So it's not enough to conserve and restore land. We also need to look at the economy and how we consume and produce things. So here, this is just from the food sector. But even by just looking at that sector, the research has found that you can get this nice U shape that you see here and actually see a recovery of biodiversity, but only if we look at production and consumption as well, which are at the heart of the circular economy. So we were thinking, can we compare a full circular scenario and see how it compares to this well-established scenario? So that's what we set out to do. So on your screen, you should see a very complicated slide with a lot of different arrows and columns. And we thought, what are the sectors that have the biggest impacts that we can see on biodiversity? And of those sectors, which sectors are also could the circular economy play a meaningful role? So where can circular economy actually help reduce the impact from that sector? So those are two steps that we have. So one, which has the biggest impact? Two, where is the circular economy relevant within those sectors? And thirdly, we also just had to figure out what kind of we actually measure. Measuring carbon dioxide equivalence is very simple by comparison, but biodiversity, as you see from the center of this slide, there are loads of different pressures that drive biodiversity loss, such as land use and climate change and pollution. So many different parameters that you have to factor in. For instance, you see this line from agriculture. We can see how much land does agriculture need, and if we make changes in agriculture, is there a change also in how much land is needed? And then that can be translated into biodiversity intactness impacts that you see on the very right side of the slide. So that's tying those changes in land use to specific. We could know from the model that we use, this is likely to be the area where you would see an increase in production or a reduction in areas under production. So that we can model. So the land use side is all, that's fine, but if we, for instance, so we heard about metals today, so we heard about mining. So you see there's a dashed or dotted line in the middle of this slide, so from mining to pollution. So that means that we can't model that because we use a land use model. And even if we could quantify how much pollution originates from mining processes, we couldn't actually tie that to specific changes in biodiversity intactness, because just the way that biodiversity loss is manifested is more also in aquatic, so in freshwater and marine ecosystems, we could see that, and we can't capture that as easily. So there are limits to what we can quantify, and we're mostly looking at the land use side. So what we have found based on this is that there are 4 sectors that have the biggest impact on biodiversity loss, but that we can model and also see a circular economy having a relevant role to play. So I should say we will publish this study in about 1 month's time. So what you see here is not the final results that we have. Just I can't stop you from sharing this, but I can just inform you that this will not be the final slides that you would see from our side. But I'm happy to share this with you in confidence anyway. So what you see is that food and agriculture play a disproportionately large role, but also buildings and construction, textiles and fibers, and forests. So what I can say at this point as well is that a circular economy in these 4 sectors can halt biodiversity loss at a global level, even if no other action is taken. So it can play a really meaningful or powerful role. And more than that, you can also start to see a recovery in part as well. So we can halt the decline and begin a recovery as well. So I think this is good news, that there are things we can do to halt the decline. And we also know that why we're doing this, we're doing a global study here, is that we know that biodiversity is an issue that we cannot solve at a country level. I think some of you are, for instance, familiar with NDC, so National Determined Contributions for Climate Change. So the similar mechanisms for countries to work on biodiversity. But one challenge is that this is, by definition, it's a global issue, that we have, for instance, dependencies on food products from other parts of the world that may become very scarce, or at least very expensive in just a few years' time. So think of products like chocolate or coffee, for instance. So we have these dependent on biodiversity in the other part of the world, and we also have impacts through our consumption and production patterns, which, at the heart of the circular economy. They're also, they cross borders through our consumption. So both through our dependencies and consumption, and just the way that biodiversity, we think of species, and many are migratory, so they will live in one country at some point and in another country at another. So even if they're safe in one country, we need to also make sure they're safe in other countries as well. So I'd say by definitions, you have to look at this through beyond. You can't just solve it at a country level. So that's one thing. We have new data to share here as well. And we've also found that some of the solutions that we look at have a really powerful contribution as well to climate mitigation. So in agriculture, for instance, 90% of methane emissions can also be tackled by a circular economy in agriculture. And also our food system is really one at the center of the challenge, and also one of the key solutions. So as you can see from the next slide, you see on the right, you see how large a share. So it's a little bit more than 2/3 of the overall circular scenario, which is this purple 100% that you see on the right. The food and agriculture sector is a substantial part of that, and especially by rethinking how we consume proteins, for instance, how we design different ways of getting protein. It's really a powerful one. But so is just by reducing food waste and loss across the value chain, and by shifting to regenerative agriculture, which is, I think very relevant also just from the point of view, if we can make do with less fertilizers and inputs such as oil and from alternative proteins as well, from that perspective, if the grain, yeah, now that food prices are rocketing, if we can use that more efficiently rather than turning it into meat, it's a very inefficient process. So it can play a very powerful role, not just for, well, national security and climate change, but also for biodiversity. It's the biggest one by far. And we're also seeing that it's not always that easy to look at this, that you see teal column as well as construction timber demand. So if we were to use more wood construction in the built environment, that might actually have a negative impact on biodiversity. So it's a bit complicated because we can also have less steel, for instance, and cement. Well, that means that buildings are lighter, so we'll need less overall material, but we'll need an increased input of wood. So it's not always straightforward, and I think it's the heart of the circular economy is that you have to look at this through a systemic lens and see what are the impacts on other parts of the economy and other value streams. So it's not always that you can say this is a good impact and it's not going to have any negative impacts besides that. But yeah, I would maybe also just like to say a few words about, so we know that yes, the circular economy can play an important role for tackling biodiversity loss as well as climate change, but what does that mean if I'm getting into the topic, well, of standards as well? I'd like to say a few words of about a project that Sitra is starting as well with science-based targets for nature. So some of you might be familiar with science-based targets for climate, but they're new science-based targets for nature that will come out, well, probably in the next year, actually, not by the end of 2022, but we're working with FIBS to pilot these new targets with Finnish companies so they can become pioneer in this work in Finland, and also to just provide input into the process as this standard is still being developed. And for you, those of you who are not familiar with science-based targets for nature, in a way, it's very simple. That as a company, what do you do? How do you make sure that you do enough of the right actions in the right places to stay within a safe and just operating space? And how that safe and just operating space is determined is, for instance, by aligning with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is still being negotiated this year. So as that has been postponed for, well, 2 years now, basically. The science-based targets have also been postponed, but it's by aligning with these conventions and making sure that with the planetary boundaries framework as well, seeing that that's the starting point, not what we can do, but where we need to be. So it's a very ambitious way of looking at nature work. And it also uses these same drivers that I had on a previous slide. So looking at these across different ecosystems. And it's essentially a five-step process where, as a company, you assess your value chain. So you map your value chain to see where do you have the biggest impacts, where can you prioritize action, which are the key hotspots. And then in the third part, that's where the real target setting comes in. And first you set a baseline. So where are we going? And set targets to see where can we get, and based on that you develop a monitoring plan. And then in the fourth step you get into the acting part, and finally it's a fifth step, you monitor and evaluate the work. So it's continuous. But just to say a few words to conclude this presentation on this act part. So companies, when they select actions to do this, the circular economy is very relevant here, and this is one area we want to explore. So rather than having the companies have to look at biodiversity as well, a lot of the actions companies are already doing, and it's by avoiding, firstly, secondly, reducing damage, and then by restoring and regenerating, and finally by driving systemic change through transformation. And we know through our circular scenario, for instance, that regenerative actions in the sectors we look at can account for about 10% of our scenario. But I think the real main contribution of a circular economy is really by avoiding and reducing the damage in the first place, by rethinking the needs and finding new ways of delivering that. So that's what we want to explore also through this project, to see what is the role in the circular economy in helping well, meet these science-based targets for nature. So I will stop there, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate. And thank you again for having me here today. Thank you.